What's considered normal today was illegal or taboo just a few decades ago. In Vietnam, only 50 years ago, a couple could go to jail simply because they got married without their parents' consent. For same-sex couples, things were even more dangerous. Their relationships were even labeled a social evil, directly compared to prostitution and drugs. But when and why did all this change? By the end of this video, you'll see how this country's history of sexuality and relationships transformed an entire society. From post-war devastation to today's dating apps, from arranged marriages to pride parades. This isn't just Vietnam's story. It shows how an entire nation rewrites its most private decisions. Generation after generation, sometimes slowly and sometimes in a single leap. In 1976, Vietnam had just emerged from war. North and South had officially reunified, but society was heading in two different directions. The North had run on a socialist, collectivist culture for decades, where the state and community mattered more than individual desires. The South, having been under French colonial and then American influence, showed slightly more Western-style social patterns. But one thing was common to both: traditional Confucian values. Confucianism defined Vietnamese family structure for centuries. Marriage wasn't seen as a personal choice, but a family duty. Parents arranged their children's marriages, and individual consent was given very little importance. According to a 2006 nationwide survey, 70% of people who married between 1976 and 1986 did so with their parents' approval. Gender roles were also very clearly defined. The man was the head of the household, carried the family lineage forward, and the woman's role was seen as managing the home and bearing children. The patrilineal system, where the family name and inheritance passed only through sons, was deeply embedded in every corner of society. But here's an interesting twist. The state itself interfered in this system too. Your job or your political social organization could approve or reject your marriage based on your political standing. A bureaucrat or factory manager literally had enough power to stop your marriage, just because your political credentials weren't right. This sounds very strange to think about today, but at the time it was considered completely normal. Romance and courtship were also heavily restricted. Couples were afraid to even sit together in public, fearing people's teasing and judgment. In one interview, a married man shared that if he and his fiancée sat together talking, friends would tease them. This shows just how tight social surveillance was at the time. Religion, Buddhism, ancestor worship, and Confucian ethics reinforced family expectations even further. Talking openly about sexuality was considered improper. Ancestor worship also had a practical effect. Every family wanted their name to carry forward, so having a son was seen as almost a moral obligation. Families would be disappointed when a daughter was born because she would go to another household after marriage. This thinking remained deeply rooted in Vietnamese households for decades. All of this forms a foundation from which the next chapter begins, the laws that codify this silence. The history of Vietnam's marriage and family laws is a fascinating case study of how a socialist state regulates its people's private lives. The first major reform was the 1959 Law on Marriage and Family, which formally abolished arranged marriages and polygamy and established the principle of gender equity. This was implemented in North Vietnam and extended across the whole country after reunification. Then came the landmark moment of 1986, significant not just economically, but socially too. That same year, Vietnam launched its Đổi Mới, or renewal policy, which moved the country from a centrally planned economy toward a market-oriented system, and the National Assembly also passed a new law on marriage and family. This law clarified the legal obligations between husband and wife, defined parental responsibilities, and created new divorce procedures. The law established 5 basic principles: voluntariness and progressiveness, monogamy, husband-wife equality, protection of parents and children's interests, and protection of mothers and children. In 1994, a new decree came in to protect families from the rapid pace of modernization, because society was changing so quickly after Đổi Mới that policymakers worried the traditional family structure might collapse. Then in 2000, another revision took place. This law was very progressive for its time. It officially recognized that a woman could have a child without a husband, banned mercenary marriages with foreigners, and, importantly, explicitly made wife-beating and child abuse illegal. Before this, there was no clear legal language for these issues. Cohabitation, which had been considered a criminal act under the 1986 law, was decriminalized, but it still wasn't given recognition equal to marriage. Same-sex relationships are a different story altogether. Homosexuality was never a criminal offense in Vietnam, which is itself quite unique in the region. But in 2000, an explicit ban was placed on same-sex marriage. In 2002, state media went as far as declaring homosexuality a social evil, equating it with prostitution and drug use. This was the darkest chapter in Vietnam's sexuality history, where the state itself was promoting stigma. The state also maintained control over consent and birth control topics. Family planning policies were strongly promoted, especially to control population growth. But individual reproductive choice was a slow, gradual process that evolved over decades. Campaigns like the two-child policy gained momentum through the 1980s and 90s via posters and radio broadcasts, permanently changing people's thinking about family size. A surprising fact is that Vietnam was legally ahead of many of its neighboring countries in several respects, such as criminalizing domestic violence and giving legal recognition to single mothers, but remained just as restrictive as other conservative societies in the region when it came to same-sex couples. This contradiction, progressive in some areas, deeply conservative in others, is a recurring pattern in Vietnam's sexuality history that we'll see again, and it makes this a unique and unpredictable case study for researchers worldwide. So far, we've seen what the law said, but the real question is, what did people actually do? In the 1970s and 80s, dating culture as we understand it today almost didn't exist. Courtship was a supervised, community-based process. Youth union meetings, collective work units, and art performances were places where young men and women could interact. But openly showing romance was a social risk. People hid their feelings because the fear of peer judgment always loomed overhead. But here's an interesting reality. There was always a gap between what the law officially said and what people actually did. Parent-arranged marriages were officially the norm, but the trend of love marriages was gradually growing, especially in urban areas. This transformation reflects a slow shift from collectivism toward individual choice. There was also a big difference between elites and ordinary people. Party officials and the urban educated class had more exposure to Western or modern ideas, while in rural, poorer communities, traditional expectations remained far more rigid. City dwellers had both privacy and resources, like cinema, magazines, and later television, which shaped their understanding of romance and relationships. In rural areas, community surveillance was so tight that deviation was almost impossible. There were also hidden realities that were never officially discussed. Same-sex attraction, for example, was completely off society's radar, neither criminalized nor accepted, just silently ignored or suppressed. People hid their identities their entire lives because there was no legal or social space at all to express themselves. Many people entered heterosexual marriages to hide their true orientation, which later became a source of emotional turmoil for those very families. Public opinion was also complicated. There was enormous stigma around divorce. A marriage breaking down wasn't seen as just a problem between two people, but a matter of the entire family's honor. All of this together created a society where there was a deep divide between private life and public expectation, a divide that would soon see a massive shift. Here comes the most powerful part of the video. If you had to find a single turning point in Vietnam's sexuality and relationship history, it would be the 1986 Đổi Mới reform. Đổi Mới wasn't just an economic policy, it was a complete societal reset. As Vietnam abandoned its closed, centrally planned economy and adopted a market-oriented system, it wasn't just factories and trade that changed. People's thinking began to change too. As material comfort improved, people were no longer satisfied by marriages built solely on continuing the family line and obedience. Individualism, which had previously been suppressed under collectivism, slowly began to emerge. Divorce, once an unspeakable shame, no longer carried as much stigma as before. This doesn't mean society changed overnight. It was a gradual generational shift that accelerated through the 1990s and 2000s. During this same period, Vietnam opened its doors to the international world. Foreign investment, tourism, and cultural exchange began to increase. This had a direct effect on people's understanding of relationships. Western media, magazines, and later the internet brought new ideas, concepts of dating, romantic love, and individual choice that were once limited only to elite classes gradually became mainstream. Women's rights were also a major part of this period. The 1986 and 2000 marriage laws gradually gave women greater legal protection. The right of single mothers to have children without a husband, the criminalization of domestic violence, and establishing a wife's legal status as equal to her husband's. This wasn't an overnight revolution, but these were the building blocks without which modern Vietnam's gender equality conversation wouldn't be possible. One more thing worth noting, the urban-rural gap became even more visible during this period. People living in cities got new jobs, new exposure, and new social circles, while rural communities remained more attached to traditional expectations. This divide remains part of Vietnam's social fabric to this day. Then came the internet era, and this was the second major turning point that we'll need to look at in detail in the next section. But for now, understand this. Đổi Mới opened the door through which every subsequent change passed. Economic liberalization prepared the ground for social liberalization. But the real turning point was yet to come, when technology and media made their way directly into people's homes, directly into their minds. The next event that occurred changed the entire direction of society. And this event was the media revolution. Until the 1990s, Vietnamese people were limited to state-controlled television and cinema. Content was heavily censored, and explicit references to romance or sexuality were almost non-existent in mainstream media. But as the economy opened up after Đổi Mới, foreign films, music, and magazines began arriving, first in limited amounts, then gradually like a flood. The expansion of television was very critical. As TV sets became common in households, people began watching dramas, foreign soap operas, and later Korean and Western content. The Korean wave, K-dramas and K-pop, had a particularly huge impact on Vietnamese youth culture. Romance, dating, and relationships began to be shown in a new, more open way. Quite different from traditional Vietnamese narratives, music and magazines also started conversations that weren't possible before. Youth magazines began publishing relationship advice, dating tips, and personal stories, things that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Then came the internet, and an even bigger game changer, social media. As smartphone penetration increased in the late 2000s and 2010s, Facebook, and later other platforms, became a new space for Vietnamese youth to express their identity, whether romantic or sexual. For the LGBTQ+ community, this was especially transformative. Social media gave them a collective voice for the first time. In 2012, Vietnam's first gay pride parade was held in Hanoi. By 2017, pride events were taking place in around 34 cities and provinces. All of this was organized and amplified through social media. What was once silent and hidden was now visible on public streets. Dating apps also completely changed the landscape of relationships over the last decade. Where courtship was once community supervised, young Vietnamese people were now finding matches through their phones without direct family or community involvement. This was a massive shift from traditional to digital courtship. And this shift also created generational conflicts, as the gap between older generations' expectations and younger generations' reality grew even wider. One more surprising fact: in 2025, Vietnam's national television channel aired its own Pride Month segment, covering the journey of a same-sex couple in the country's evolving drag scene. Think about it. The same state media that called homosexuality a social evil in 2002 was celebrating the same topic on national television by 2025. This transformation is perhaps the most dramatic reversal in Vietnam's sexuality history. So today, in 2026, where does Vietnam stand? Current attitudes are quite divided, but the trend is clearly moving in a more open direction. Marriage trends are changing, people are marrying at a later age, and cohabitation before marriage is no longer as taboo as it once was. Among urban, educated youth, love marriages have become the norm, replacing arranged marriages. Dating culture has completely transformed. Romantic connections now form through apps, social media, and peer networks, rather than family introductions. This is especially visible in cities like Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, where young professionals are making their own choices about relationships. Vietnam has shown interesting progress on LGBTQ+ rights. Same-sex sexual activity was never criminalized in Vietnam, but same-sex marriage still isn't legally recognized. A significant step came in 2015 when the National Assembly passed an amendment to the Civil Code allowing legal gender change. In 2022, the Ministry of Health officially declared that homosexuality is not a disease and banned conversion therapy. A huge symbolic and practical win for the LGBTQ+ community. Public opinion is also shifting rapidly. According to polling data, around 65% of Vietnamese respondents supported same-sex marriage in 2023, and by 2024, this number rose to about 67%. Support is even higher among young people, aged 18 to 34. This makes Vietnam one of the most supportive countries in Southeast Asia on this issue, ahead of Thailand, Cambodia, and Malaysia. Activists have pushed for marriage equality through the I Do campaign, collecting tens of thousands of signatures. But due to technical and political reasons, marriage law revision couldn't be included in the 2024-2025 legislative agenda. Advocates now expect it in the 2025-2030 period. Economic experts have also joined this conversation. Studies suggest that legalizing marriage equality could give Vietnam's economy a meaningful boost through revenue growth in the wedding industry, tourism, and family-related businesses, as well as reducing the economic costs associated with LGBTQ-related mental health issues. This is a new angle that was never discussed before, that inclusion isn't just a moral issue, but can be an economic strategy too. Birth rates are another important trend. As urbanization and individualism have increased, Vietnam's birth rate has gradually declined, a pattern common across East and Southeast Asia. This demographic shift is directly connected to changing marriage and family patterns. People want fewer children, marry later, and prioritize career over starting a family. Now let's talk about the future. And this might be the most fascinating part. artificial intelligence has already begun changing the dynamics of relationships. AI-powered dating apps, using better matching algorithms, are already becoming common. But beyond this, virtual companionship and AI chatbots that simulate emotional connection are gaining popularity among young people, especially those who find traditional dating stressful or inaccessible. Virtual relationships are a growing global trend, and Vietnam won't be an exception. As technology becomes even more advanced, we may see people begin fulfilling their emotional needs through digital platforms, which will coexist with traditional human relationships in complicated ways. Demographic changes will also continue to have an impact. Declining birth rates mean an aging population, which will create policy challenges for the government, from family planning incentives to elder care. Some experts predict that Vietnam will reform its family policies again to encourage young couples to marry and have children. The future of marriage equality is also an open question. Economic experts have argued that legalizing same-sex marriage could boost Vietnam's economy through the wedding industry, tourism, and mental health cost savings. Support numbers are rising, and if this trend continues, Vietnam could become the first country in its region to give marriage equality full legal recognition by 2030. Future predictions also suggest that gender roles will become even more fluid, especially in urban centers, while rural areas will adapt at a slower pace. This divide between tradition and modernity has been a defining theme in Vietnam's sexuality history, and it will continue in the coming decades. Some experts also predict that if economic pressure, such as labor shortages, or brain drain linked to a lack of inclusive policies, continues to grow, the government will move more quickly toward inclusive family policies, not just for social justice, but as an economic necessity too. So let's do a comparison. Then versus now, a quick side-by-side timeline. In 1976, a Vietnamese couple's marriage was decided by their parents. Divorce was considered a family's shame. Homosexuality was labeled a social evil, and people hid their true identity their entire lives. Even showing romance in public was a social risk. In 2026, young Vietnamese people are finding partners through apps. Love marriages have become the norm, and pride parades take place in multiple cities across the country. The government itself has declared homosexuality not a disease, and marriage equality has become a real, active political conversation, not just a taboo topic. This transformation didn't happen because of laws alone. It happened because of Đổi Mới economic reforms, the expansion of media and the internet, and a new generation whose priorities are completely different from their parents. And perhaps the most interesting part is that this journey isn't over yet. Same-sex marriage is still waiting for legal recognition, birth rates are declining, and technologies like AI are already beginning to write the next chapter. So here's a question to leave you with. Do you think this change was better for society, or were some important values lost in the process? Let us know in the comments. See you in the next video.